Hello, and welcome back to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. This past Sunday, we celebrated Father's Day. And on today's episode, Father Boquet and I discuss the important role that fathers play in their children's emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being. Sadly, masculinity and fatherhood are under attack in today's society. But the data is clear. Children are better off when they grow up with involved dads. So what can you and I do about it? And why is it so important that our younger generations see healthy examples of fatherhood and of marriage? Towards the end of the episode, Father Boquet and I put out a special request to our audience. Could you please leave your favorite examples of masculinity and fatherhood in the comment section? These can be characters from books, movies, TV shows, or your favorite saints. In a world that often degrades men in the media, it's really important that we can uphold shining examples of men who lived out their vocations of husband and father well. As always, please remember to like and subscribe. And without further ado, please welcome Father Boquet to Living a Culture of Life. Welcome back to the podcast, Father.
It's always a blessing to be with you, Colleen.
It's great to have you here, and I'm really excited for today's topic today because we're going to be discussing fatherhood, which you recently wrote your Spirit and Life article on that in honor of Father's Day. And I actually saw a lot of conversation online this Father's Day about the importance of fathers and different statistics showing what happens to kids when they grow up without fathers in their homes. So let's just start there. When you were writing your article, what statistics did you look at showing what happens when kids grow up without a father?
Well, thanks, Colleen. We've actually, I've addressed this topic, many times in different articles, bringing in different conversation. But the one thing that always stands out to me on the sense of statistics is the negative consequences, when a father is absent from the home, and as we have addressed several times, sometimes it could be caused by the death of the father. So it's not always a negative consequence like separation, divorce, abandonment, abusive situations. It could be, from the fact that the dad died as a young man. And so the children are being raised in a situation that both husband and wife never anticipated. And so the statistics really tell us a lot about what's happening in the social sciences. So what's happening to people physically, mentally, and also from our perspective, what's happening spiritually within the family. So it's great to see many, I too saw many articles and saw many people speaking on the subject of fatherhood from different angles. And I think it's great because we all know that, fatherhood has been so demoralized in the culture, and it's been demeaned in social media, movies, television programs. And so in this so-called toxic masculinity environment that people kind of activists are trying to promote, it's in the sense, what is the beauty of fatherhood? And why is it important that we, recognize God's design, that he made man for woman and woman for man and made them in an indissoluble union, and together they become co-creators with God and the gift of children. It's God's design. So what happens when that design is broken, for whatever reason? What happens? What are the consequences? And how do we address it as a culture?
Yeah, no, exactly. Could you first talk about this, what children are affected spiritually? Because that's a very unique angle that obviously, coming from a Catholic perspective, you're able to bring to the conversation that just data-based studies aren't going to be able to look at.
Sure. So
or aren't going to look at.
What many of the studies, show to us is something that just is very intuitive in the sense of when you realize that when there is a parent, whether it be the mom or the dad, absent from the home, because both mom and dad have a very unique role that they share in many ways because they're mom and dad and husband and wife, but they also have unique responsibilities and they offer a very unique perspective and share very unique gifts to the family. So in our situation, by looking at this as I did, as others have done, is when the father is removed. So when we consider the role of the father and what he brings to this relationship in the family, is the importance of stability, the sense of protection, the continuity that he is present, he is there, he's pointing in direction of even a moral direction. He's giving a direction through his support of his wife, his service to his family, the sacrifices he makes on a daily basis, providing for his family, and making those decisions with his wife, for the good of their family. And so it's really, that's why at the end of my article, I return to, Paul's letter to the Ephesians in chapter 5, which is so often, misquoted, misunderstood, and sometimes not even preached enough, from the pulpits concerning what does it actually show us. And what I just articulated is it's the beauty of servanthood, and so the husband takes his model from Christ, who came to serve and not be served. And he reminds us that, that the father and husband is really about service. His headship comes from his service, comes from his humility, and is willing to give of himself, to die to himself, to sacrifice all for the good and the well-being of his wife, his family, and to help with his wife to lead his children toward eternal life. That this is what he lives for. This is what he drives him each and every day. And so all of his decision making in partnership with his wife, as husband and wife, mom and dad, working toward the good of their children, is aiming them constantly toward that narrow path. And so that in the sense of real human flourishing, true authentic development within the family, this is what he wakes up to every day. This is what in a sense, it's a mission, which is why I returned to St. Joseph. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but, St. Joseph, again, is this perfect model of this, because he's called by God, vocation, given a mission. Do not be afraid. He takes up this mission, and out of great love for his wife, great love for Our Lady, he dedicates himself completely to her well-being and the caring of the child that she bears, the Word of God made flesh. And he will sacrifice everything to protect them, as he would in any moving from, one town, or when Herod was there to try to kill the child. He takes her and flees to protect her. And I think this is so important. This has nothing to do but about subservience. In a sense, wives be submissive to their husbands in the Lord, which often, again, gets said, but the rest of the package never comes. So Joseph shows, this model, and as Paul makes Christ the model of the groom, the husband, and, for the church. And this is what fathers need to hear, husbands need to hear. And this is not the message, that's out in the social media. It's not out there in the entertainment realm. So it really is a challenge today to be a man and to be a boy growing up in such an environment. So we need role models, as Pope Leo's been already talking about, role models.
Yes, for sure. What happens to kids if they grow up without a father, with their relationship to God? How does it affect their relationship with God as father if they grew up without a father?
Right. And so, when we speak of God the Father, so we just recently celebrated the beautiful gift of the recognition of the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so our Lord Jesus speaks of the Father, so often. And so when we pray, Jesus teaches us how to address God, our Father. And so when a child, whether a boy or girl, doesn't have that the presence of the father in the home, who is modeling fatherhood in his imperfection, in his struggle and striving every day, to his own life to grow in holiness and virtue and lead his family, but he's modeling that stability, that constancy of presence, that protectiveness, that providing, the steward of the home. He's giving all these attributes, characteristics that we often speak of God, who is faithful to us, who is always looking after us. He's listening to our pleas. He answers our cries. He's leading us. He's shepherding us. And so when that is missing, and as well-intended as many moms are, and as I said earlier when we began, for reasons that they never would anticipate to be raising their children alone, try to provide those attributes. But it's as best as that is, there's still something missing, because it's the idea that father is absent, and she brings her own gift, she brings her own role to the conversation. But it's important for when you see the flip side of that, when the father is abusive, he's abandoned, he's been in a sense of not leading in a spiritual way, of vulgarities, the lifestyle he's living is so contrary to an understanding of God the Father, that a child looks at this and has a hard time really understanding the fatherhood of God, that Jesus reveals to us and shows to us in his own manifestation of life and obedience to the Father and what that means. So when that is missing within the home life, the Father, he may be present, but he may be present in the wrong way. And then when he's not present, the consequences are there as well. So it's important for us to pause. And, and I would say as a priest within the church, as a shepherd of souls, and I say this, to any of my brothers who will be listening, and especially for our bishops, and since this is, as the social sciences are showing us and the studies are revealing, we all know what's happening. What are we doing to address that? How do we counteract this narrative, but and also how do we respond to the future generation, which is what I began with quoting Pope Leo, that speaking about the fact that our young people are looking, for direction, they're looking for purpose, they're looking for answers. And so when you have all these negative realities, it's hard to know where to turn and where to find the answer to those questions.
Yeah, for sure. It's also, we had an episode recently on the DeChristianization of America and how America is growing less and less religious. And it makes sense that as you have generations growing up in homes that don't have fathers, their relationship with God the Father is going to be much more tense. There's going to be a tension there that they wouldn't have if they grew up with that loving father. And so I wonder if the DeChristianization of America is at least partially linked to the number of children who are growing up without fathers present in the home, or with a father who is abusive, or, it has negative characteristics that then they then apply to God.
Sure. And I mean, for myself, being in the family I was raised in, I was very fortunate, blessed, to have good role models, within my grandfathers, within my father, within, many of the men that I became associated with in parish life, and including the priest. Very much role models, and each one bringing different gifts to the table, and expressing fatherhood in very unique ways, and so it's in the sense of modeling, what it means to be a man. What are those attributes that are virtuous? A word that we don't speak enough about, virtue. We need those models of the virtues: patience, kindness, tenderness, firm resolve, stability, constancy. All these become, mirrored to us, through the people around us. And even when we don't maybe have them in our home directly, but there are other avenues too.
Here's my devil's advocate question then. Couldn't a mother model patience, generosity, stability as well? Like, why is the role of father so unique there?
Sure. And I think absolutely, and many mothers, obviously reflect that very beautifully, and sometimes even more so than husbands and fathers. But the reality is that each brings with them, it's not a competition between mom or dad. It's a harmonious relationship that is meant to be a sign of unity back to God, working as one for the great good, the good of each other, the development of each other, and as sons and daughters of God, to help each other grow in holiness together through their vocation, and then obviously the fruit of their love, the begetting of children, and the great gift there is to educate their children, to form their children, and as the church teaches so beautifully, the most important way they educate is to help their children to know the eternal life. And so it's important to see them not in any competitive role, and absolutely both bring different gifts and different approaches to those realities. So it's for myself, when focusing on one doesn't diminish the other, but really speaks about both bringing what they need to bring in modeling the virtues. And I think, for example, when I think of my grandfathers, and I think of the example of them, they, to many people, especially as a little child, you thought them to be kind of rough and tough. But they were not rough. They were tough, and they were firm, and there was a sense of purpose. There was a duty they had. And, when they had to feed their children and care for their family and make sure that, especially on the farms that we lived on, making sure that the livestock, making sure the crops, there was a purpose to the day. And there was times for play, and there was times where you didn't play. and you had to know the difference between them. And so, but they also brought, not only that, but the sense of how they're leading their families.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see both of my grandmothers and sharing in that so vividly, And one way that would be done was, as any family knows, what did your dad tell you? Our dad would say, what did your mother tell you? And so to me, that's how you see them, this great harmony working together, recognizing the importance of dad's leadership, the head of the family. What did your father tell you? Supporting that. And in reverse, not playing, as kids often do, can play parents against each other, but how can dad, also support mom and her responsibility and her duty and her obligation and her authority that she also virtuously shows. So it's a both and, and either, and that's not what you lead on, but just the idea that it's important to see how does each one recognize the virtue and how does each one live the virtue. I think most people, depending on what upbringing they have, more than likely would say mom was probably more patient and probably more kind. And some people might flip it over and say, no, dad was much more patient and dad was much more kind. And so, but each one is working out this journey together. And children are observant. We call them parroting, so the child is mimicking what they see. And it can be in a very good way, and these are the things that I picked up on. And if I may just add one little comma, godparents play a crucial role in this as well. As the church teaches so beautifully, they are co-parents and is sharing in the parenthood of the child. And I knew my godfather only by vagueness of memory. He died when I was 3. So I don't have a very, very much of a memory other than just a few little snapshots that I have in my mind. But my godmother played a significant role, which I have talked about many times in here. And so she truly, though never being able to beget children, she was indeed a mother to many. And so she showed motherhood in a very unique way. And I have several men, back to our fathers, that were not my blood relationship at all, but were my spiritual fathers, both laymen and priests. And again, each one, showed the virtues in many ways, and also servanthood in many ways, and each one brought their own ways of approachment.
Yeah.
And I have to say that, I think this is what's so important about why the father is so crucial in the home, and why the mother is so crucial in the home. That it's because they each have their unique blessings and gifts and skills that God gives to us and bestows upon us and helps shape in us that we bring to the table. And my last point, and I'll toss it back to you, is the idea of back to God's design.
Yeah.
God designed, this relationship to be indissoluble. Why? Because of the good of children, the good of each other, but for the good of children. And when we break that, right, of our own means, of our own intention, right, we cause harm, we cause difficulty, we break that which God said should not be broken.
No, for sure. I'm also glad you brought up the godparents aspect of this as well. I was really I was impressed on Sunday on Father's Day when they did the blessing for all the fathers, and they also called on the godfathers. And I was like, that's a nice touch of reminding godfathers that this is an important role and you are a father of sorts. So I actually want to touch on the social aspects of fathers and why they're important. So the University of Virginia, a bunch of scholars there released a report recently called Good Fathers, Flourishing Kids, The Importance of Fatherhood in Virginia. And it was just interesting because they touched on a number of different aspects of how fathers benefit their children. And one of the things they noticed was that boys who have involved dads boys and girls get better grades. And then boys with involved dads in particular were less likely to get contacted by the school of sending notes home or contacting the parents being your child's misbehaving at school. Right. And then girls had less depression. And obviously girls also had less school contacts and boys also had less depression, but the school contacts for boys, the depression for girls were the big things that stood out. And it was just interesting how not having a father present affects girls' mental health very negatively, and not having a father present affects boys like acting out negatively. And so that was one of the things I noticed. And then another thing that they talked about in it was that the three big ways that fathers make a difference at home. And the first one they said was play. And when we had Dr. Pat Fagan on the podcast last year, no, 2 years ago, wow, he was talking about the importance of fathers playing. And basically, fathers, when they play with their kids, tend to be a little bit more roughhousing, a little bit more excitement, adrenaline going, like it's more unpredictable. And that helped kids to apparently control their bodies and control their emotions more. And then the children who had involved fathers tended to be more popular with their peers because they had more like social confidence because of all this. Like they tied it back to the play, and then also risk taking and discipline. So children who had involved fathers tended to be more likely to take risks, and they were better disciplined and didn't act out as much at home or at school. So anyway, I just thought it was a really interesting like new report showing how important it is to have fathers present in the home. And I know you touched on some of this in your article as well. So what were some of the things that you wrote about?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll kind of add a little bit to the some of those examples. So I mentioned here, in my column, which I know you put in the show notes, so people can link up to the column, and all the links are there as well. So I make note of the American Psychological Association. I give a PBS, study here, and also just another study that came out, just kind of showing what happens both with young ladies, so girls, what happens with young boys. And with the American Psychological Association was looking at kind of 10 years even before COVID, then looking beyond the years of COVID. So the depression of young girls when there was a father that was absent, and the difficulties that the young ladies were struggling with, and they tended to be much more toward depression, much more toward kind of mental difficulties and struggling with emotional difficulties, whereas then the young men was on a different spectrum, but showed their own, difficulties and own struggles in the absence. And if just kind of building on that in some of the examples you gave. So again, because each parent brings to the table their own uniqueness as male, as female, mom, dad, husband, wife. But one thing, for myself, you were talking about play. Play is also more than just sports. And what would the sports teach as well? And many moms are also very avid in sports, and so it teaches discipline. It teaches responsibility. Coming up on a farm, one thing our fathers used was discipline. Care for the animals, responsibility toward them, making sure things were properly cleaned, making sure they were fed at the same time every day. These were very important. And if you neglected it, it wasn't just that you didn't feel like getting up, you didn't feel like doing something. It had a consequence to it. Not just your own consequence, personal consequence, but a consequence to the harmony, of the farm. And the fact of it is that neglect had an impact. So also, like for example, when fathers teach not only sports, but for example, the sport of hunting. Another good example. We were taught very clearly, you just don't kill just to kill something. This is not a sport in that regard. That we were taught to be responsible for what we did, and and to treat the animals that we were hunting with great respect. And don't kill that which you're not going to eat. So whatever these things were taught to us, and the same way of moms, teaching us very clearly that she labored hard to prepare this wonderful meal. And when you sat there and you just kind of snubbed your nose at something, there's a disrespect, because she gave of her time, her energy, her love, her concern for our well-being, and to be respectful and to be appreciative and to be grateful. So there are many ways that play and can teach us. And and I love how you explain that, and it's so true, because moms play very differently with their kids than dads, and so but each one is teaching them something. And it's the same thing. It's in a sense of when you think of what I think of the word that gets lost is the word chivalry. It's lost today, that dads do bring, and this is what I mean. How does a husband treat his wife? How does he respond to her? How does he, how is he attentive to her? How is he caring toward her? And how does he dote over her? There's many other words, of course. And the children are seeing this. Boys see it, girls see it. And so they see the respect that dad has and the honor he has for his wife and the care that he has for her, and the fact how he also does not tolerate disrespect toward mom, and from any of the children. So he makes sure that with a firm resolve that to have respect, for your mother, and how mom turns out as well. How do they respect dad? So that's why, again, I return to, even though talking about fatherhood, this harmonious, this unified effort that husbands and wives both bring to the table in informing their children and shaping their mindset, because that's what we're talking about here. And how a father also brings to the table about how to address human sexuality. So again, I think in many ways, one is, how does he treat his wife? And how does he honor her? And this is very visible, how his tone, his language, his mannerisms, gestures, his cutefulness at times, his playfulness even with her. How kids see this and they're attracted toward this, and how mom reverses that toward him. These are very, very important. And also with that, when a father, is able to, especially with a son, back to fatherhood, is able to sit down with a son, at the appropriate time as a dad and mom would know for their children, is to speak on the beauty of human sexuality, what's happening, to them, especially as puberty becomes, more evident, and how to discipline the body, how to discipline emotion, how not to give way to your passions and your appetites. Well, that starts very, very early, when a child might want to throw a little temper tantrum because they didn't get what they wanted or have what they thought they needed. And so again, dad, mom are shaping the mind, shaping the heart, preparing them to make better decisions, to have control of their emotion, to have discipline over their appetites. And that reflects, and so imagine if, I think in either case, but especially with a dad, if he's absent from that home. Because then these moments of him showing his own, way of controlling his temper that can be easily let go of, when emotion gets the better of someone, how to say I'm sorry, how to be forgiving, how to be compassionate, how to have mercy. Kids learn this, and especially boys, who again, can, with their own emotions and their own upbringing and their own looking for adventure and curiosity, can lead them astray, and that's where the father comes back in and just, gives the son enough rope to get far enough out, show his independence, but still enough hold to pull him back, to pull back, just as God the Father does to us, and as the image of the Good Shepherd,
Well, and that also, talking about letting kids go out and then pull them back, that was part of what they were saying with risk taking. As part of it is that dads encourage kids to take risks, but then they also provide this very stabilizing presence where kids know that there's like a safety net to fall back on if necessary. So they're more comfortable taking risks because they know that dad is there grounding them as well. And I know that's not quite what you were touching on, but I wanted to kind of bring that up because I loved that imagery of just like dads being that like rock right there, allowing kids to go out and take those risks, knowing that they have somewhere safe to return.
Exactly. And this is, I can still see in my own mind's eye, my mother and father kind of tagging, on that. For example, I love to hunt. And especially when I still like to hunt. I don't get a chance as much anymore. But when Dad would bring us out to teach us how to use the weapon, how to clean the weapon, how to respect it, and Mom, being concerned and kind of saying to my dad, "Are you sure? Is it time yet?" Kind of, and you can see them both working this out together, but always with the well-being of their child.
Okay, I have to ask, what were you hunting in Louisiana?
So obviously, duck, rabbit, a deer, just
alligator.
Alligator, only later in life.
Okay.
My dad was not into that part, and so, but it was. I can still see it, and watching. Saying my dad loves horses still to this day, rides horses, and I can still see, being put on the back of a horse, and and him very protectively watching, at the same time giving a little room, learning from the fall, learning from different things, learning from your own mistakes, and what did you learn today? What did you understand today? And so absolutely. So I think these are very important, and because each dad, each man, each woman, each mom are unique. And so I think what parents need to do is definitely to work together and to have that vision that I shared earlier about working toward a common goal, which is the formation of their children, and to shape them spiritually, mentally, physically, all with the first intent is to prepare them for eternal life. So it's and all the other things are important too.
Well, that leads us right into my next question, which is that in your article you were writing about how masculinity, fatherhood is under attack in today's society. And I thought it was interesting because you really narrowed it down to there's two, like the society attacks masculinity in two ways, either by teaching boys to fear their power or by teaching them to abuse their power.
Right.
And I want to talk about that. I want to have a little side conversation here before we jump into that. I think a lot of modern audiences, when they hear about like masculine power, can be a little bit taken aback. They're uncomfortable with that topic. What would you say to people who are listening who are like scared of masculine power and like that idea of, especially women, of like men being a lot more powerful and like who might feel uncomfortable with that? What would you say to them?
I think we have to really take control of the narrative. I mean, what's happened today is, as you already made note of, and is that when the narrative controls how people approach this topic. So, but power, authority, headship, these are all very important. And it's how a person uses these gifts, uses these tools, how they approach the use of them, is really what's important here. And they're given for a particular end. They have a particular purpose involved. And we've lost sight of the purpose. We've lost sight of the responsibility for those gifts too, and how to temper them, all right, and how to discipline them, and when to exercise them. And so today, I mean, with all honesty, we have such poor models of this, so that people are kind of visualizing these poor models. But it's also the narrative, so that's why I mentioned, the media and the entertainment industry have so, just taking this beautiful gift of manhood and what masculinity is, and we've just stripped it. Of all of its wonder and its awe, just like we've done the motherhood.
Well, I feel like this is kind of why I wanted to bring it up, was just like, I feel like society has painted this very negative view of like masculine power, even within, and like, this is obviously a conversation that needs to be raised, but even when it is brought up in like conservative circles, it's often talking about like men and women's sports and things like that, where it's still seen as a negative thing, where it's a threat to women, even though those masculine gifts are good within the context of like male sports. And so I just kind of wanted to touch on that, because I think people can be a little taken aback, a little bit like, I am uncomfortable with men having power. And so that's, I'm glad that you're talking about how we have to take control of the narrative and how that power is like serving authority, headship in a positive manner.
I go back to St. Joseph. I mean, it's just the example. I mean, he, in Paul's letter to the Ephesians, it's just when we properly understand, and to that, we look to the perfect model of manhood, and that's our Lord Jesus Christ, who shows us what real power is given for. What does he say? You don't lord authority over. You don't. The reality is that it's given for a specific purpose, and it's to be exercised in given moments. But you definitely need authority. You need governance. You need, in a sense of protection. You need these abilities to be able to express the headship that is so important, in our lives, but especially within the family structure. And we've lost sight. We've been told to be afraid of these things, and it's false. Even Pope John Paul II talks about this machismo that he mentions in Familiaris Consortio, a word that most people don't even think about today. But he's just talking about, again, these false narratives, this false understanding of man, masculinity, of fatherhood, that have really just kind of veiled what really is so beautiful and so good. And that is man. That is the gift of what it means to be man, and to bring that wonderful gift that God has given to man to the table, to the life of a family, to the society, to the common good, and that's what we got to talk about. And
so then how does society teach young boys to fear their power?
Right. So if you think about this, with the absence of a father, or with the way that the media and entertainment realm and so forth have been for decades controlling the narrative. So if you do show any kind of leadership, authority, any kind of, in a sense of lordship over something. You're told that that you're bad, you're evil, this is not good. Boys are told to reject their father in this regard. To this is not something, you have to kind of strip yourself from that reality. This is why they assault the church so much with regard to the way the church looks at how the father is the head of the home. And what does that mean? And so sadly, the narrative of the world is that's not true. This is not good. And then
men and women are equal in everything.
Right.
And there's
That's
no
correct.
difference whatsoever between the sexes.
Correct. Just kind of equating everything, but more than that, they kind of subverting man, and just taking him and not, it's not so much even equalizing. They're putting him below. And I've seen this in many TV programs, many sitcoms, mocking fatherhood, mocking manhood, mocking these attributes that we often associate with men in a sense of their virility and their ability to lead and to take ownership of responsibility, whatever the dynamic may be. And it's just, this narrative has been in control and is still in control. And so and all the more when the father is absent, so when he abandons his family, all the more the narrative gets fed. When he abandons his wife, what does that say? So, or when he's abusive toward his wife, toward his children, it just feeds the narrative. And so we really have to to retake the conversation. But as Pope Leo has been again saying, and that is, we need models. We need to lift up. And there's not just one, and that's why we can't just lift up. We lift up the principle. We lift up the good. We lift up what is true, the trueness of man, and lift that up.
Well, and this is why media is so important, because I think sometimes if you're not encountering those models in your everyday life because of whatever home situation, social situation you're in, having books, movies, TV shows, different things that have good masculine figures that people gravitate towards, that can be a way of modeling it if you're not able to see it in everyday life around you.
And I have several stories of life to this point of my journey. And I remember, caring for a father who was dying from cancer. And I remember so beautifully, the kids were young. They weren't, and he knew that he would not be there. And so I watched him over the last year of his life spend more time with his children. And what always came to mind to me was no greater love. And so here he was facing his own, finality, the reality outside of a direct intervention of God's hand. This disease was going to overtake his life. And he knew that he was not abandoning, but he was leaving. And I can see those moments so vividly still. But he was also bringing in key men into the family. So friends of his that he knew all of his life, who would become good models. And he would tell the children, he says, there's no one that can take my place, in the sense of that, your mother and I brought you into this world through God's blessing, but there are many people who can help you. That when I can't be here, they can. And this is something, again, shows a beautiful gift of a father protecting, guiding, shepherding, assuring, ensuring. There's so many ways that, and we all have these kinds of stories and all these kinds of encounters. And what I noticed for Father's Day, and I don't, the only way I'm on Facebook is because of HLI. So I see HLI's Facebook, but people send me images. And what I noticed this Father's Day was people showing a kind of a generational approach to fatherhood. Great-grandfather, grandfather, father, grandsons, and which it was amazing to see people looking at it, the influences of our lives, and how, we are, in a sense, grandsons of our grandfathers. They shaped our lives. And so we have to see what fathers bring and how they can mold with their wives their beautiful family. But that family always stands out to me. I remember that so beautifully, because again, not everything of a sense of an absent father is because of an direct intent. It can come from the unexpected, like some of our families in the military.
Yeah.
whose dads died serving our country,
Yeah.
and how many of those sons and daughters today who remember their fathers, their sacrifices, and for the great good, the greater good. So these are things that we need. That's the narrative.
Yeah.
We have to take the narrative, and we have to be able to challenge, that the narrative of demeaning fatherhood, demeaning men, the idea of allowing this so-called toxic masculinity narrative to be in charge when it's not, and to be able to say it's a way of activist taking control of a conversation. We don't want the negative narrative to be what drives even our own conversations.
Yeah.
We have to promote the good, raise up the good, and call us to the good. And so, which means we have to speak to the good and speak to the beauty of God's design. And part of that really is, Colleen, we have to really also form. We have to educate. So we have to really pull back, and this is why a column I've been working on for another periodical, is on the role of parents in education.
Yeah.
And one thing that's so important is that education begins from the moment that life begins, and to be able to realize that how do we shape this mind and this heart, and for their lifetime, and so how do we retake the narrative? Well, we do it by working with our young people, our young children, and for those who are married, to look at marriage as it is a great good vocation, and to recognize the beauty of marriage, the wonder of marriage, the awe of marriage, and to understand that the two become one, a reflection of God, who's one, and the gift they bring to each other, and the self-giving they bring. And to change the narrative means that this is an indissoluble relationship, and that there will be good times and bad, but we will work it out together. There will be moments when there will be richness and there will be poverty, but we will do this together. There was working things out. See, that's part of the narrative today, that this idea of freedom of to choose. The people, and that affects not just abortion conversations, it affects everything.
It's very
and they
individualistic.
valorize this to the point that it's the supreme God, that I can do whatever I want. Well, no, that's false. There are consequences to every act.
It's a false sense of freedom.
Exactly. And so, but to take the responsibility that to prepare oneself before you marry, ensure that this is what the person that you are called to, that you believe that is the person that you are called to live your life, your vocation, to this individual that you will commit your lifetime to. That you will love in good times and bad, that you will do everything to lift up and to support and to care for, and that you will honor. All these beautiful words are just words, but they have to be lived. And when they're lived, they become attractive. They become contagious. Why do you think the devil attacks the family so much? Why has he been so successful in breaking down the family? Because he knows the great link in the family is the father and the mother. You break that link, you break that family. And so he knows the harm it does. So that's why this is a spiritual issue.
It is.
And also, so how do we take that narrative by again, returning to the good? And so to be faithful, we have to help young people, though, because that's not maybe their experience. So their experience could be all the things that you've been mentioning with the different studies and the different, things on the TVs and radio programs and so forth and so on. But so, and they don't see. And I thought it was so interesting when Pope Leo raised up the parents of Saint Therese of Lisieux. And he in a beautiful 13 children, if I remember correctly, in the family. I don't remember the number. I think it's 13 kids they had.
A number of them died, though.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'm not sure. Don't hold me to the number perfectly.
I think because they had 5 daughters, I believe, who survived.
Right.
But yeah, I think they had a multiple.
But some are religious. There's one that's a beatified. But the Holy Father was raising up. Part of me was the beauty of the parents that shaped the life of their family. The domestic church is what we call it.
Exactly.
And so they shaped, and this is what I'm to me is kind of what my rally call is that that the church herself always speaks to the good. She speaks to the truth, but we also have to model it.
Yes.
So we have to raise it up to a world that no longer sees this, hears this. And it's always interesting when you speak to people who are married, or maybe have sadly gone through a broken relationship in marriage, very tragically, they speak back to their grandparents. Well, that's getting further and further removed because sometimes it's the grandparents that were the first ones to break, and then so forth and so on. So from my memory, the age I am, my grandparents stayed with each other until one passed, right? My great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents. So I have a memory, of stability, fidelity, responsibility, accountability, and so which affected, pretty much most of that first generation within my own, so my first cousins, right? Not all, but the great majority, right? So, and again, these situations occur that they never thought that they would be dealing with, and the other person leaves them. But the idea is we have to reform, re-educate, reteach, and we have to have models for that. And we shouldn't be looking to the TV. We shouldn't be looking to the government. We shouldn't be looking, to radio or to entertainment industry for this, because they're not going to give it to us.
Yeah.
All right? They're not going to give it to you. So we have to turn back toward who has always been the advocate, who has always been the one speaking to it, and that's the church, right? The one who holds the good that's entrusted to her. Yeah. And I believe that's why Pope Leo is doing exactly what he's doing. He's speaking to a world that's lost this vision. We have to give that vision back.
I want to go to a little bit. So we talked about how society tells young boys to fear their power. How does society tell boys to abuse their power or to give into it? Because I think that's the other side that this often, I think, infiltrates more of the conservative circles, with different people gravitating towards people like Andrew Tate, who have this idea of like teaching men to be men, but then also use women, which is not a healthy view of masculinity. And I think this is kind of where it gets a little bit more murky in conservative circles. So like, how does society do this?
Well, one of the ways it does this, you just gave an example, all right? But the second one really is you look at the whole pornography industry and the whole way that we truly just use women, both sexually, emotionally, physically, and discard responsibility. The whole abortion industry feeds this whole thing. The whole contraceptive industry feeds this thing. So ultimately, it's an assault on the beauty of human sexuality. That's feeding this frenzy. Because the gift that is given is not given to lord over or to exploit or to manipulate or to violate, in any way, or to abandon one's accountability. But that's what we see with so much of our culture today that celebrates, this lack of responsibility and pleasure as the golden calf, one's own personal, happiness, at the cost of anyone else. And that's why even the pornography industry is becoming more and more violent. People are watching. I mean, study after study is showing how that's affecting how men approach relationships and how women would they expect from a relationship. So this is talk about toxic. That's toxic, and so that's a driving force in this element, and because more and more women and men are addicted to pornography. I mean, this is controlling how they think of the other sex, how they approach men or how they approach women or how they approach a relationship with each other. And this also affects when the father is absent, back to that absent fatherhood. So if the father is not truly, virtuously, living and expressing authentic human sexuality, then how does that affect both the daughter and the son and how they approach sexuality, and how does that affect their understanding of affiliation with other people? How do they relate to men? How do they relate to women? It's all learned, through their father and through their mother, and each one differently, and each one in their respective manner contribute to the whole. And when one or both are missing, it can be detrimental, and we've seen study after study as a result of that. And so this is why it's important. Again, that's what I love about our church. The church has been constant in this throughout the centuries. When we violate a good, it doesn't end well, right? And again, it's just that's just the individual. It affects society. We are social beings. And so that's why, pornography has always been, as an example of something that affects society, affects this culture. It's never a good. And this is, I don't care if it's someone's free will to choose this kind of livelihood. It's a violation of self, of human dignity. it's a violation of others, and it promotes exploitation and the whole manipulation of sexuality.
Yeah.
And so this is what, especially boys more than young ladies, are the ones that are attracted to the pornography industry, though those numbers are changing.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a huge driving force.
No, that definitely makes sense. And it was interesting because the University of Virginia, the UVA study, actually talked about limiting access to porn and its like recommendations of things to do to strengthen fatherhood in Virginia.
Right.
Because they basically, the report went through and was like, hey, these are all the benefits of having fathers. Okay, now what as a state can we do to try to help support current fathers and also raise young boys up to be fathers? And I was really surprised and thankful to see that they had limiting access to porn as one of their recommendations.
Exactly. Hopefully limited means bringing it down to zero.
Well, yeah, but yeah.
And what's so sad is that we've even conditioned society to believe that someone has the freedom to choose that for a livelihood. It's an entertainment. But it's something that we have to take back that as well. That's just, it's never good for any individual or for the good of society. It is truly violates human dignity at every level. Every level. And and also with that, how does that reflect in the entertainment industry? How does it become part of and what I mean by entertainment, the mainline movies, the TV programs? I mean, you can see how that narrative flows even through most movies. Sexual scenes, the exploitation of men toward women, and now the roles being switched, and so forth. And it's just all this has residual.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for our audience, maybe who may or may not be aware, at one time, and here I'm by the state, had an invested interest in the family.
Yeah.
And that's why divorce was illegal. Why, separation outside of very strict situations was not permissible in a sense. Once you're married, you have responsibility. But the state it was incentivizing this. Why? Because of the good of the family, right? What the church says, that fundamental cell of society, right? State upheld that and recognized the good of the children, for the good of the children, and holding that family unit, because it was that cell upon which society would build. And so we're literally undermining our own society by undermining that fundamental cell. And so it's in the state's best interest to promote fidelity, exclusivity, and to promote family life, to encourage family life, and to encourage responsibility. We've taught men, back to fatherhood, to be irresponsible. We've taught men not to take accountability. We've taught men, by the phraseology and the euphemisms of the day, her body, her right, all this false narrative. This is what we've taught. And we wonder why we're having the problems we're having.
We have, just like, also going back to the media, just an assault on men. Like, apparently when men create Instagram accounts, if you say that you're a man when you're doing it, Instagram starts kicking up more and more and more explicit imagery to them, like, and a lot more than with women. And so you just also have like this manipulation of algorithms to try to push an agenda on men that is attacking their masculinity.
That's right. And so there's a direct will that's aimed at manipulating what is a great good. Whether it be of true femininity, true masculinity, and the beauty of being husband and wife, and the wonder of being a mother and a father.
Okay, here's a question. I know you said we shouldn't look towards television and media and all of that for examples of masculinity. But I also am a huge advocate of stories being able to kind of illustrate things in a way that's emotionally moving that just intellectually teaching someone doesn't always do. What are some examples in like either books, literature, movies that you can think of that model masculinity well? Well, totally just throwing this at you without any prep.
Off the top of my mind right now, there's nothing that comes physically to mind, but there is a place, for these goods, right? For these tools. So, but what I meant earlier, and I'm glad you're bringing this up, is that because we've lost the current narrative, the ones that how they're driving. But if I just pull back in time, to various programs that came out in the 60s or maybe early 70s, very different approach toward family life and towards the husbands and wives and so forth. so there is a proper place, and I think that there are no doubt, and you probably have a few in mind because you brought up the question, is that there are definitely many sources out there. For myself, of course, I'm always drawn, toward, the history of the church and with her saints and the blesseds and the examples of husbands and wives. And, I think of, an example here of Giorgio Frassati, who's going to be canonized, in September the 7th. Here's a young man from 1901, born in 1901, if I remember the date, or in the early 1900s. And, just truly manifested a life that was virtuous. So that's a book. That's an example, and there are people like that, that we can be drawn to, so I do believe that there is a proper place, but maybe right now, in the sense that my point was being is that if we're looking toward the secular media, secular press, secular entertainment world, we're not going to get that right now, because that's not what we're talking about. Is not what the producers and directors and screenwriters are doing, because that's not what they're being told to direct toward. There are different examples. For example, when you think of, I think of Mel Gibson, The Passion, for example, was told, "Oh, this will never get anywhere. This will never produce anything." No, it's complete opposite.
Yeah.
And there are many examples like that. So that went against the grain, against the narrative, and no doubt there are several. And I hope maybe what the audience will do is maybe they'll send us examples so that it'll help me remember them.
Yeah, like off the top of my head, I was thinking of like Andy Griffith, or like Pa in the Little House books, or Atticus in To Kill a Mockingbird. Like I can think of a few different examples from different. Those are all obviously a little bit older, but I feel like sometimes the examples of different fatherly figures in literature can help kind of just like paint that illustration, like that idea in your mind of like someone who can model it if you haven't had that model in your own life.
Right. Yeah. So. I mean, I love reading. There's no doubt, those of us who gravitate towards particular genres and particular, topics in the sense of looking for examples, they do inspire us. And they do remind us of the great good. So definitely, I think that maybe that would be a program we ought to bring them and come and discuss a litany of books. And
I'd love that. I would love that.
So maybe our audience can, if you have examples,
leave us some books in the comment section. Yeah. Let us know what we should talk about.
Right, and so because what I remember, and maybe that's just we're closing with this, is that back when in working in parish ministry and parochial systems, and looking at the woundedness of family life, and just looking at from young kids to teenagers to young adults, when something's missing, we're looking for a way to fill that, and sometimes we go looking in the wrong places, and because we don't have anyone pointing us to the right places. So what I'd say is that a way to resolve a lot of this is pointing people back to that modeling. So I think if we need to think of ourselves, how do we model? So I'm not married, no children, but as a spiritual father, how do I model fatherhood? How do I model masculinity? How do I model what it means to be a man? So this is very important, and it's something I'm conscious of. And how do I speak to people? How do I react to certain situations? How do I deal, with emotion? How do I deal with temptation? These all are things that are not just affecting me. So I think maybe for our audience, is, for each of us to ask ourselves, how are we, as women, how are we lifting up men? How do we lift up the great good? If we are men, how do we lift up that same good? While at the same time, how do we lift up the beauty of womanhood? Femininity? How do we give witness to these great goods? And as parents who are listening, how are you reflecting this to your children? My mom and my dad, and particularly my dad, might have given many disciplinary rules, but those rules are always. We never forget what he said to me when there was a time to have retribution in the sense of what I've done. To have punishment for what I've done because I stepped out of line. I remember so vividly him telling me to reprimand you, to use that word punish. And that's another narrative word people don't like to hear. But the idea is that it hurts me more than you realize. So it's the idea, but he knew he had to do what he had to do. to teach me about the good and to help me to see that what I did was wrong and why it was wrong. So that, again, is an importance of fathers, and, with in partnership with their wives, working to form, to shape, to create this beautiful, wonderful person that will be a good for themselves, a good for others, and a good for our culture and our society. And so I think that's so important. So I think we all have to see how we play in this, and also what our children are seeing on TV, what are they watching on movies, what are other people influencing them, what kind of friends they have. All this influences are very important. And I'll close with this. Maybe my parents, were very concerned about who I hung around with. They were very concerned about who I associated with, and making sure that you can't always control everything. There will always be temptations and influences out there, but you have to be able to discipline, until that person is capable of making right decisions. And until then, you have to shape it. You have to literally shape it. And that's where fathers play a significant role in shaping.
Well, thank you, Father. This has been a great discussion. I'm glad we finally got a chance to talk about this topic on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, a little longer than usual, but I hope it is beneficial.
It's an important topic. I'm glad we were able to have it. And obviously, if it goes a little bit longer, then so it does. And to all of our audience, please let us know examples of literature or in movies of good fathers in the comment section. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on that. And as always, please keep on living the culture of life. God bless.